Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today I'm going to tell you what I think is the most difficult IELTS line graph I've ever seen. I'm going to show you why it's so difficult, what mistakes people make when describing it, and then how you can answer it. I'll do that last one by showing you my own sample Band 9 answer. As always, I've divided this video into chapters so that you can jump backwards and forwards to guide your studies. But I do recommend watching the whole thing for the maximum benefit. Also, I've added subtitles so you can turn those on if you have any trouble understanding me. Right, let's jump into today's lesson. Let's start by looking at this incredibly difficult line graph. At first glance, it probably doesn't look that hard, does it? For one thing, there's only one graph. You've probably encountered IELTS questions that feature a line graph in a table or a line graph in a pie chart. Those certainly look a lot harder. Beyond that, there's only 6 lines. Well, that's quite a few, but it's not an excessive amount. As for the header and legend, they don't present much in the way of difficulty. There are no particularly challenging words or ideas, so why am I telling you that this is a really difficult line graph to describe? If you watched my video on the worst mistakes you could make in the IELTS Writing Task 1, you would know that using verb tenses correctly is very important. A small mistake with tense choice could completely change the meaning of your sentence and confuse your reader. That poses a challenge for IELTS candidates with the most basic of line graphs, but it is especially difficult here. Let's look closely at the horizontal axis on this graph. That's the one along the bottom and the one that tells us the time frame. Here we can see that it begins in the past, runs up to the present, and then continues into the future. But if we look at the task up top, it says the data is from 2008. So perhaps you can now understand what I mean by it being a difficult question. In describing the energy trends of the United States during this period, you cannot rely on any one verb tense. Instead, you're going to have to talk carefully about the past, the present, and the future. You might be thinking, well, I know those tenses, but consider that this forces you into making inconvenient choices about where to divide the data, because you can't just pick the most suitable part. Also, as no one can see into the future, you need to use language that highlights the fact that all the future data is speculative. Let's examine how we can do all of this in the next section. With most IELTS line graphs, you need to have a good grasp of the past simple and past perfect tenses. Here's an example of a fairly easy one. About a line graph like this, we can say things such as, the United Kingdom had the highest carbon dioxide emissions per person in each of the recorded years, or it began at around 11 metric tons in 1967 and gradually declined to 9 metric tons by 2007. It is comparatively straightforward. You might look at our new line graph and think it's equally easy to describe. Lots of people say things like, the amount of coal used doubled from about 15 quadrillion units to slightly over 30 quadrillion. This seems logical, right? It is true that the amount shown in the graph does increase from 15 to 30 quadrillion units, but of course some of this increase comes from the future, so it's not an appropriate tense choice. To do this correctly, you need to either describe the data in the past first and the future second, or else work out a way of incorporating both into the same sentence. To divide them, we can simply pick the data from the past and talk about it. For example, at the start of the period, the amount of energy generated by coal was slightly lower than the amount produced by natural gas, but by 1995 this had changed. While natural gas usage remained somewhat stable, the amount of energy produced by coal had increased by nearly 50%. This is a good description and used the aforementioned past simple and past perfect tenses. We could go on to bring this up to the present moment by saying things like, thereafter, natural gas overtook coal to contribute slightly more to US energy consumption in the year 2000, but since then they have been at quite similar levels. Notice that I have switched from the past simple to the present perfect, and use the word since to tie the past and present together. This also avoids the tricky situation of how to refer to 2008 and the fact that the past 13 years of data is technically a projection. To move into the future, I could say, it is predicted that natural gas will remain at about its current level, approximately 25 quadrillion units, until 2030. However, coal use will most likely increase during that time frame, reaching a high of about 30 quadrillion. Of course, that is quite a long and detailed description. In fact, it would make up more than half the word count of some IELTS writing Task 1 reports. So perhaps there is an easier way to describe this. Well, we could condense this information down into one sentence. Coal and natural gas stayed at similar levels, although natural gas was used more than coal at the beginning of the period, and coal is projected to grow more popular by 2030. This overlooks a lot of detail, but remember that you've been asked to, quote, summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features, not to give a complete description of every little detail. This graph presents a few challenges in terms of vocabulary and even its basic meaning. Many of the students on my IELTS writing correction service, details below, struggle to understand precisely what the chart is showing. They often interpret it backwards, which is to say that they think the energy mentioned is used to produce coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. But this is not true. If we read carefully and think logically, we can see that these types of fuel are all sources of energy. Part of the problem is the ambiguous phrasing of the task and the heading of the graph. The heading talks about consumption, and while one says energy consumption, the other says consumption of energy. This leads people into the incorrect belief that these types of fuel are all using the energy rather than creating it. Beyond that, the use of consumption unfortunately leads people to overuse the word consume. Why would this be wrong? Well, consumption refers to the use of something, but whilst consume can sort of have that meaning, it much more frequently means to eat something. Almost every time I see an answer to this question, the candidate will have used the word consume incorrectly. The most common problem is saying things like, petrol and oil were the most consumed fuels, which blends a misunderstanding of the data with a misunderstanding of this word. It implies that people are eating or drinking petrol and oil. Beyond just consume, people often try to cram the word consumers into their essay, but this isn't really appropriate either. Whilst the people using the energy produced are certainly consumers of it, we don't really know anything about them, and so we cannot readily talk about them here. I mentioned earlier that the difficulties people face with choosing tenses often leads to a forced choice about grouping data. If you can't think of a careful way to incorporate the past, present, and future, you will need to divide the graph in two so that you can talk about them separately. Indeed, structuring any IELTS writing Task 1 description can pose such challenges. Sometimes it is straightforward, but often it is a major headache to group your data. Here we have several choices. We can separate the past and the future. We could group the top 3 and the bottom 3 lines, or we could group the top line, the middle 2, and the bottom 3. Personally, I would use the second option. That's because I feel it allows me to compare the top 3 rather than having petrol and oil separate. It also avoids having too many paragraphs, which would lead to a lack of development and possible weakness in cohesion. If you want to learn more about grouping data and structuring your IELTS writing Task 1 reports, I've written 2 useful guides about these areas, which I will link to in the description below. Let's look now at my sample Band 9 answer for this. As always, please be aware that a sample answer is not necessarily a model to be followed. It is not, after all, the only way of writing a great essay. However, I want to show you how a very difficult essay can be tackled in a simple way. First of all, I'll mention that it takes a 3-paragraph structure. I include my introduction and overview in the same paragraph to avoid the problem of having single-sentence paragraphs. which I really think is not ideal. And as I mentioned before, I've grouped the top 3 lines and the bottom 3 lines into separate paragraphs in order to compare and contrast more effectively. I will also start with the most interesting data, which is the stuff up top. For my introduction, I wrote, "This line graph shows energy usage in the United States between 1980 and 2030. The report is from 2008, and so every year after that is a projection rather than an actual recording. There are 6 types of fuel recorded and significant differences between the volume of each used by Americans." So I have changed the word consumption for usage and mentioned the issue of the data coming from 2008 and thus everything after that being a projection. I've stated the number of fuels but not listed them. A lot of IELTS candidates are so eager to reach the minimum word count that they list utterly pointless details in their introductions. My second paragraph handles the top 3 lines. From the start of the period to the end, by far the most popular fuel type is petrol and oil, which in 1980 sat at 35 quadrillion units, and by 2030 is projected to have risen to nearly 50 quadrillion units. This is vastly higher than the next 2 most common fuel types, coal and natural gas. These stayed at similar levels, although natural gas was used more than coal at the beginning of the period, and coal is projected to grow more popular by 2030. Note that my first clauses here are in the present simple tense. This is in reference to the line graph rather than the data it represents. It is an easy way of giving an overview that avoids tricky tense changes. The relative clause begins a more specific look at the issue of time and divides the data accordingly into past and future. The middle sentence compares the top line with the next 2, and the final sentence gives details about the past and future of coal and natural gas, briefly summarizing and comparing them. Paragraph 3 then handles the final 3 lines on the graph. Far below are the remaining 3 sources of energy: nuclear, solar and wind, and hydropower. These all began at around the same level in 1980, but nuclear and solar and wind are expected to grow slightly by 2030, whereas hydropower is anticipated to decline a little in popularity. Again, it is a nice and simple description that compares all the different lines and divides them loosely into the past and the future. There's a slightly awkward detail, which is how to include the line labeled solar and wind. Importantly, you should convert this from its abbreviated form into proper grammar, replacing the slash with an and. Using the Oxford comma also makes your meaning clearer, and I highly recommend you use this for all your IELTS essays. Overall, this is a good report that covers everything needed and does so with correct grammar and vocabulary. As I said, it is not the only way to write a Band 9 answer, but it does provide a pretty basic framework that can be adapted to other essays. You can watch this video if you want to see what I think about sample Band 9 answers. Today we have learned about one of the most difficult IELTS Writing Task 1 questions. We have seen that it is deceptively simple, and that in and of itself is something to learn from. Never take these tasks at face value. Always spend a few minutes to think what exactly the data shows and what exactly you must do. In this case, it was important to identify the fact that these fuels were sources of energy and to reflect their usage through accurate language. Most challenging is the issue of showing the past, present, and future through verb tense, particularly because this data comes from 2008. However, hopefully I've shown you some useful ways to handle questions of this nature. If this video has been useful, please consider giving it a like, and you can also subscribe to the channel for weekly IELTS video lessons. I post a new one every Friday, and I try to pack them all full of realistic and actionable advice that will give you a better chance of achieving a high score in your next exam.